From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
This sit-in is just the beginning. President Morsi has become a dictator. So why did we have a revolution? In order for there to be democracy. Protests
continue in Cairo's Tahrir Square after Egyptian President Mohamed Morsi issues a decree seizing new powers. Morsi made the move one day after he helped secure a ceasefire ending Israel's assault on Gaza.
Thank President Morsi for his personal leadership to de-escalate the situation in Gaza and end the violence.
We'll go to Cairo to speak with Democracy Now! Correspondent Sharif Abdel-Quddus, just back from Gaza. Then Black Friday at Walmart.
The nation is finally catching up with what's going on at Walmart. It is one thing to say low price, low price, low price, but there's a price to the low price. The price of the low price is these poor workers inside who have to live on $8.81 an hour. Can barely make it. They are all in, most of them are on food stamp or Medicaid, and that's a shame for the leading retailer in this country.
Walmart workers and their supporters staged protests on the busiest shopping day of the year at more than 1,000 stores across the United States. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Delegates from around the world are gathering in Qatar today for the annual round of global climate talks under the auspices of the United Nations. The two-week Doha Climate Change Conference comes at the end of the last year that the binding emissions cuts agreed to under the 1997 Kyoto Protocol are in effect. But no new emissions limits are expected, barring a radical reversal from the U.S., which itself never ratified the Kyoto Treaty after signing it. The UN Framework Convention on Climate Change pledged to cap global temperature rises at 2 degrees Celsius at the 2010 summit in Cancun, but new figures show greenhouse gas emissions hit a record high last year. According to the UN, the world is now on pace for a global temperature rise of between 3 and 5 degrees Celsius. Unveiling the latest findings, the chief scientist of the UN Environment Program, Joe Alcamo, warned current emissions standards will be insufficient to stop devastating climate change.
Over 45 scientists from around the world came to the conclusion that by 2020, if we just complied with current pledges that the countries have made to reduce emissions, global emissions would not be low enough to be on track to the 2-degree climate target. So in other words, we cannot wait until 2020 to have stringent emission reductions. We know what the challenge is. It's a question now of taking action. Between now and 2020, through the negotiations, we can tighten up the rules for complying with pledges. That would lead to a reduction in emissions.
Tune in to Democracy Now! Starting next Monday as we continue our annual coverage of the UN Climate Change Conference. We'll be on the ground all week in Doha. At least 118 people have been killed, many injured, in a massive fire at a garment factory in Bangladesh. The victims are reportedly working overtime, making clothes for major U.S. retailers, including Walmart and Sears, when the fire tore through their workplace Saturday. The Tazreen fashion factory lacked fire escapes on its top floor, stranding and ultimately killing many workers unable to flee. A second fire has broken out at a different Bangladeshi factory earlier today, with 8 injuries reported so far. We'll have more on this story later in the broadcast. Israel's assault on the Gaza Strip ended in a ceasefire last week, with the final toll standing at about 170 Palestinians killed and more than 700 wounded. Meanwhile, in Israel, 4 Israeli civilians and 2 Israeli soldiers were killed, along with dozens of others wounded in Palestinian attacks. At a news conference, a Hamas government spokesperson said an initial estimate of the damage to Gaza from 8 days of bombing stood at over $1.2 billion.
Our first estimation of the damage caused due to aggression is 200 residential buildings were destroyed and 8,000 other dwellings were damaged. The losses were around $1.25 billion US dollars, $545 million in direct losses, and $700 million US dollars in indirect losses.
Under a deal brokered by Egypt, Israel agreed to temporarily halt attacks on Gaza, including the assassination of militant leaders, while Hamas and other Palestinian factions agreed to stop rocket firings at Israel. Israel also committed to a limited easing of restrictions on Gaza, including an opening of border crossings, more freedom of movement for people and goods, and access for Palestinian fishers off the Gaza coast. The ceasefire prompted scenes of wide celebration in Gaza, with thousands of people flooding the streets after Israeli attacks stopped Wednesday night. The jubilation was short-lived, however, as Israeli forces continued to fire on Gaza in the following days, killing one civilian and wounding several others who'd walked into the buffer zone along Gaza's border with Israel. The slain victim had been trying to place a Hamas flag on the border wall. Palestinian medical officials say the death toll of around 170 Palestinians in Gaza included between 24 to 34 children. In a statement, the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child warned the conflict has had, quote, a devastating and lasting impact on children, with deep trauma and other psychological effects on children on both sides of the border. At least one Gaza school was completely destroyed by Israeli shelling. One young Palestinian boy reported witnessing his brother's decapitation when metal from an Israeli bombing tore off the victim's head as he slept. Diane Araki, the chief of the UNICEF field office in Gaza, said she'd witnessed a number of children suffering.
I was seeing children who have been injured from the conflict, and children on ventilators, children bruised, and their bruised bodies, and they were very much suffering.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu confirmed the ceasefire by specifically mentioning it had come at the behest of the United States. But speaking at a news conference, Netanyahu warned Israel's preparing to launch what he called a more severe assault.
I know there are citizens expecting a more severe military action, and perhaps we shall need to do so. But at this time, the right thing for the State of Israel is to use this opportunity to achieve a long-lasting ceasefire.
In the aftermath of the Gaza assault, Israeli Defense Minister Ehud Barak has announced he's planning to retire from political life in the coming months. Barak served as Israeli Prime Minister from 1999 to 2001, radically expanding settlement construction in the occupied territories while engaging in peace talks that ultimately collapsed at Camp David. He returned to government as Israel's defense minister in 2007, presiding over the Operation Cast-led attack on Gaza that killed more than 1,300 Palestinians at the end of 2008. Nearly 4 years before he presided over the most recent Israeli assault. Following the ceasefire, reports have emerged bolstering speculation Israel launched the assault as a means to prepare for a potential future attack on Iran. Citing unnamed American and Israeli officials, the New York Times reports the Gaza assault and the rocket attacks it provoked were, quote, something of a practice run for any future armed confrontation with Iran, featuring improved rockets that can reach Jerusalem and new anti-missile systems to counter them. At the United Nations, Palestinian Ambassador Riyad Mansour denounced Israel for using the Gaza assault as what he called, quote, an experiment.
The Palestinian people should not be the experiment for the Israeli forces to try to kill hundreds and to wound thousands of Palestinians at their will. We have to put an end to the options of war and to open the gate for option of peace, ending the occupation and the independence of our state.
The two main Palestinian factions, Fatah and Hamas, meanwhile, have expressed an increased willingness to attempt a unity agreement after years of rivalry. Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas says he'll pursue reconciliation talks right after his attempt to gain recognition of Palestine as an observer state at the United Nations later this week. In an interview with CNN, Hamas's political leader, Khaled Mashal, reaffirmed his acceptance of a Palestinian state within the 1967 borders, but rejected the long-standing U.S.-Israeli demand that Palestinians go further and also recognize Israel's right to exist.
I accept a state of the 1967. How can I accept Israel? They have occupied my land. the Palestinians today and in the past and Hamas have agreed about a program, a national program that accepts the 67 borders, but the Israelis don't accept. So it is all about it's up to the Israelis, and the international community is failing to do us justice.
We'll have more on the Gaza ceasefire later in the broadcast. The Obama administration is reportedly hoping to keep some 10,000 troops in Afghanistan after the formal end of combat operations in 2014. The White House has long billed its 2014 deadline as an end to the Afghan war, but it's quietly prepared plans for a residual troop presence to train Afghan forces and conduct so-called counterterrorism operations. According to the Wall Street Journal, the proposed 10,000-strong U.S. force still requires approval from the Afghan government. A key issue of contention is said to be whether U.S. soldiers will fall under the jurisdiction of Afghan courts. Protests have erupted in Egypt over President Mohamed Morsi's self-appointment of wide-ranging powers and protections from judicial review or oversight late last week. On Sunday, security forces fired tear gas at hundreds of protesters in and around Tahrir Square in the country's capital, Cairo. More than 500 people have been injured in clashes between police and protesters since the decree was issued. We'll go to Democracy Now! Correspondent Sharif Al-Bokadous in Cairo after headlines. A warning to our television viewers of graphic images. Syrian activists are accusing government forces of dropping a cluster bomb at a playground, killing 10 children. The activists say the attack took place in the village of Deir al-Asafir. Videos have surfaced showing grieving mothers standing over the bodies of their slain children. Syrian government troops and rebel fighters have been engaged in an ongoing fight for control of a nearby military base. Rebels in the Democratic Republic of the Congo are facing a deadline of today to withdraw from the country's largest eastern city, Goma, after seizing it last week. The conflict between the DRC government and M23 rebels from Rwanda has forced the displacement of thousands of surrounding residents. A regional summit of African countries has given the M23 until later today to withdraw from all of the seized territory in the eastern Congo, but the rebels have balked so far. At the United Nations, a spokesperson for the High Commissioner for Human Rights warned the violence continues to prevent access to civilians in need.
Ongoing with the recent fighting in and around the city, UNHCR is extremely concerned about the situation of displaced people in North Kivu in particular, especially children and other vulnerable groups. Normally we work in 31 displaced camps in North Kivu, hosting just over 108,000 people. The fighting has meant that we and our partners have not been able to access most of these areas.
The Obama administration's quietly warning Bahrain's ongoing internal unrest could lead to the overthrow of the ruling Sunni monarchy. Protests have continued in Bahrain for nearly 2 years, despite a U.S.-backed crackdown that's seen the use of military forces from neighboring Gulf regimes, the jailing and beating of opposition activists, and the recent ban of all public demonstrations. In a briefing to reporters last week, 2 State Department officials warned Bahrain could break apart if the protests continue, an outcome they say would be beneficial to Iran while detrimental to the, quote, enormous security interests, U.S. security interests in Bahrain, which hosts the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet. The officials gave the briefing on the condition they not be identified by name. The White House says it's calling on Bahrain to heed the calls of an independent commission that urged political reforms 1 year ago. At the United Nations, a spokesperson for the High Commissioner for Human Rights criticized Bahrain's recent moves against the opposition, including revoking the citizenship of 31 political figures, as well as sentencing medics who treated wounded protesters to 3 months behind bars.
The government to reconsider this decision, which stands in clear violation of Article 15 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which states that, again I quote, everyone has the right to a nationality and no one shall be arbitrarily deprived of his nationality. The High Commissioner is also concerned by the sentencing of 23 medical professionals on the 21st of November and reiterates her call on the authorities to release all individuals who have been detained or sentenced simply for exercising their right to demonstrate peacefully.
The United Nations says it'll send a fact-finding mission to assess human rights conditions in Bahrain early next month. Historic protests struck the retail giant Walmart nationwide on Black Friday, the day after Thanksgiving, the busiest shopping day of the year. Walmart workers and their supporters demonstrated at around 1,000 stores in 100 cities across the United States, demanding improvements to wages and working conditions. The protests were organized in part by Our Walmart, an organization led by Walmart workers and backed by the United Food and Commercial Workers Union. We'll have more on this story later in the broadcast. The Obama administration's reportedly accelerated an effort to codify its set of standards for waging drone attacks overseas. The New York Times reports the White House rushed to cobble together a framework for the drone strikes to pass on should President Obama have lost his bid for re-election. The standards are said to now have a lower priority amongst White House officials, with Obama having won a second term. According to the New York Times, the U.S. has killed some 2,500 people in more than 300 drone strikes since President Obama took office. And the veteran civil rights activist Lawrence Guyot has died at the age of 73. Guyot began his activism as an anti-racism organizer with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in Mississippi during the 1960s, spearheading African-American voter registration and nearly losing his life to one of several brutal beatings he suffered while in jail. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Good.